Welcome to the Jacobus Vanderveer House. This presentation will introduce you to this historic place and the people who lived here. The Vanderveer House is where the history of this part of New Jersey and of the nation intersect, and the house tells us two important connected stories about the Bedminster area in the 1700s. On the one hand, it tells us of the experiences of the Dutch-American Vanderveer family and life in this part of New Jersey when settlers of European origin first made their homes here. On the other hand, the 1700s brought events to the Raritan Valley that would contribute to the creation of the United States. The Vanderveer House is closely linked to a crucial turning point in the American Revolution that took place nearby, the Pluckemin Cantonment, where American military education was born. Historic documents and archaeological evidence strongly suggest that in the winter of 1778 to 79, General Henry Knox, the cantonment's commanding officer, used the Vanderveer House as his headquarters and temporary home for his family. Jacobus Vanderveer was the first member of his family and one of the first people of European descent to be born in this area. His parents were originally from the Flatbush area of Brooklyn and were part of a tight-knit, conservative Dutch immigrant community that was centered on the Dutch Reformed Church. When he was born in 1743, Jacobus was already 3 generations removed from his ancestor who had come to Brooklyn from the Netherlands in the mid-1600s, but he still maintained a number of Dutch-American traditions. These traditions included holding enslaved workers, as well as harboring resentment of the British for their takeover of the New Amsterdam colony when it became New York. This resentment meant that many Dutch Americans in New York and New Jersey sided with the revolutionary colonists from British backgrounds. Jacobus maintained strong ties to his Dutch American church and the community connected to it in the Bedminster area and beyond. The Vanderveer House was originally part of a large farm of over 500 acres. Jacobus was given the land for the farm by his father, who owned over 1,000 acres in this area, and who was one of the wealthiest individuals in Somerset County at the time of his death in 1776. The family's homestead, as well as the family mill on the north branch of the Raritan River, stood to the south of the Vanderveer House and on the other side of the road where Route 206 is today. Around 1772, Jacobus began to build a house for himself and his young wife Winch on the land he received from his father. At the time, he was around 30 and she was about 17 years old. Jacobus's property was immediately south of the community's Dutch Reformed Church. His father had donated the land to the congregation from his estate. The graveyard near the Vanderveer House today is the only remnant of the church that survives. The house that Jacobus and Winch lived in was laid out like most colonial houses with its longest side to the south to take maximum advantage of natural solar light and winter heat. Chimneys on the interior wall served not only as hearths, but also as masonry radiators that warmed the adjacent spaces. Although the Vanderveers were among the wealthiest families in the area, their lives were still very rural. The kind of furniture they owned, made by local craftsmen, and the architecture of the house itself were both relatively simple and conservative in comparison to the high-style homes and furnishings of the wealthiest residents of the colony's urban centers, New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. The Vanderveer House was built using construction methods that came from Northern European medieval traditions. As you visit the house, you will see its heavy timbers and the brick between the timbers called nogging, as well as wattle and daub, a type of wall insulation created by applying a mix of soil, sand, and clay to a structure of woven sticks. Jacobus and Winch were joined in their new house by at least one enslaved African American, a woman named June, whom Jacobus inherited from his father along with the land for his farm. At the time, it was common for Dutch Americans in northern New Jersey to hold slaves. and Jacobus held up to 6 at any point during his lifetime. This was comparable to the number of enslaved workers in other wealthy households in the area. The Vanderveer farm was well developed within 5 years of the completion of the house about 1773, and Jacobus may even have been growing crops on the land his father gave him before a house was built on it. In May of 1778, Jacobus was taxed for 14 horses, 26 cattle, and 5 hogs. The Vanderveers' farm buildings would have included a gabled Dutch-style barn, such as those that you see here in other Dutch-American sites, as well as a number of other structures, such as a smokehouse, a granary, a hog house, and a chicken coop. These secondary structures would probably have included Dutch-style hay barracks, which consisted of a kind of movable roof structure on uprights to shelter and raise hay on a platform. Tragedy struck the Vanderveers in 1777. While Jacobus and Winch were creating a life on the farm in their new house, she died, along with their infant daughter who had been born the year before. These sad events in the life of the Vanderveers coincided with momentous developments across the colonies as the skirmishes of 1775 turned steadily toward full-scale revolution. In 1778, the war arrived in the lives of the Vanderveers. Near the end of November, Jacobus's brother Elias, who had inherited the family homestead, was captured by British troops and died in their custody. Elias's death was almost certainly related to his sympathies for the Continental Army's cause. In December, George Washington ordered the artillery section of his army to Pluckemin. This force consisted of machines of war such as mortar and cannon, and the soldiers and officers who moved and operated them. Most of Washington's infantry troops were stationed a few miles south near Somerville, close enough to protect the artillery at Pluckemin from the British forces in New York. The artillery forces were led by General Henry Knox, a Boston native. After being apprenticed to a bookseller in his youth, Henry opened his own bookstore in Boston in 1771. He stocked a large number of military works for his British officer customers and mastered their content. His bookstore became a gathering place for young, well-to-do Bostonians, including his future wife, Lucy, daughter of Royal Provincial Secretary Thomas Flucker. With the outbreak of hostilities in Boston in 1775, Henry and Lucy escaped through British lines in the summer. Lucy thus chose life with her husband over her Loyalist family. At the end of the year and the beginning of 1776, Henry led a daring raid and captured cannon and munitions from the British at Fort Ticonderoga, hauling the guns 300 miles through winter ice in western Massachusetts to Washington's forces in Boston. Henry was promoted to brigadier general and distinguished himself in the battles of Trenton and Princeton, Brandywine, Germantown, and Monmouth. Between December 1778 and June 1779, Knox supervised the creation and use of the Pluckemin Cantonment, a term that means a military installation or barracks. The soldiers under Knox's command cleared an area on the western mountain slope north of the village of Pluckemin to create the encampment. An impressive complex of buildings in an E-shaped plan served 3 purposes: housing the artillery troops and officers and camp followers, creating new weapons to resupply Washington's army, and training the artillery forces. The largest building at the center of the complex provided classes to officers each day on the complicated techniques and details of using weapons and ordnance to the greatest effect. This academy was the birthplace of American military education. Like some other Revolutionary officers' wives, Lucy Knox accompanied her husband into the field. Historic documents strongly suggest that the Knoxes stayed at the Vanderveer House during the cantonment, using this relatively new building, located within convenient traveling distance to the encampment, as their temporary home and as the general's headquarters. Here, the Knoxes would have continued their family life, and Knox would have met with his fellow officers to socialize and strategize in the Vanderveers' parlor. Lucy arrived here while pregnant with the couple's second child. She was also accompanied by their daughter Lucy. Julia Knox was born in March 1779, but both mother and child were very sick after the birth. When the artillery forces left Pluckemin in June, neither Julia nor Lucy was well enough to leave. Julia died in July, one of the 9 children of the couple who would not survive to adulthood. After the Revolution, Jacobus Vanderveer married for the second time. He and his wife Maria had several children who survived childhood, including a son named Henry. Jacobus died in 1810 at the age of 66, one of the wealthiest residents of the county. He left some of his traditional Dutch ways behind by the end of his life, using the more English name James instead of Jacobus, showing that he and his family had become at least as American as Dutch American. When Henry Vanderveer inherited his father's estate, he was 23. He married and proceeded to expand his father's house considerably to the size that you see today. Henry's addition was done in much more mainstream federal architectural style. Sadly, while the addition was being finished, Henry died at the young age of 25. His widow Frances and their young daughter Mary left the house, never to return again. No Vanderveers ever lived here after that point, and during much of the 19th century, the farm was a rental property. Eventually, it was sold out of the family and endured a number of alterations in the early 20th century. In 1989, the house and adjacent lands were acquired by Bedminster Township. The friends of the Jacobus Vanderveer House restored and furnished the property as you see it today, beginning in 2002. As you go through the house, you will see rooms furnished as they would have been when Jacobus Vanderveer and Henry Knox and their families lived here, as well as spaces that house other exhibitions. We hope you will enjoy your trip to this important part of the region's and nation's past, and your visit to the Jacobus Vanderveer House.